everybody. Welcome back to Goodnight Lighthouse. I'm Miss Dorothy, and I'm here to read you another story. And I'm excited because we're going to visit somebody that we recently met. Do you remember not too long ago, we read a book called Lyle the Crocodile? That was a fun book. Well, I found more about Lyle. This book is called Lovable Lyle. Lovable Lyle. There's Lyle, and he's home with his family, and we know everybody loves Lyle. Or do they? Could it be that somebody doesn't love Lyle? I can't imagine why not, because he is such a lovable crocodile. But we're going to have to get into this book and find out what happens. Are you ready to get into this Lyle the Crocodile book with Miss Dorothy? Good. I need you to sit up and listen up, because here we go. Lovable Lyle, written by Bernard Waber. Everyone loved Lyle the Crocodile. The Prim family, with whom he lived, loved him dearly, of course. And the bakery lady loved him. She always gave Lyle a cookie, his favorite kind, with colorful sprinkles on top. And Mr. Delight, the ice cream man, loved him. He always invited Lyle to climb aboard his truck and clang the bell. And Bird loved him. Love Lyle, squawked Bird. Everybody loves Lyle. And the children loved him. They always called for Lyle to come out and play. And in return, Lyle loved the whole wide, wonderful world. He didn't have one single enemy in it, or so he thought. One day, quite mysteriously, a note addressed to Lyle was slipped under the door of the house on East 88th Street. Dear Lyle, Mr. Prim read to him, I hate you. I hate you more than anything. I hate you so much I can't stand it. And the note was signed, Your Enemy. Everyone was so surprised. Oh, how dreadful, cried Mrs. Prim. Whatever reason could anyone have for hating Lyle? That is so terribly mean. You should never say you hate someone. Don't worry about it, Lyle, said Mr. Prim. Just keep being your wonderful self and try to forget this ever happened. Lyle went off to bed that night, trying hard to forget. Still, as he switched off the lights and gazed down upon the empty street below, he could not help sadly think, somebody out there hates me? Poor Lyle. The next day, Lyle lost himself in play and managed to forget all about that note, only to be reminded by a second one delivered as mysteriously as the first. Dear Lyle, read Mrs. Prim, I hate you even more today than I did yesterday, if that is at all possible. And again the note was signed, Your Enemy. Oh, these horrible notes have got to stop, Mrs. Prim cried out desperately. Lyle wanted the notes to stop too. He was so unhappy about them. There were days he just couldn't be coaxed out of the house. He began to wonder if he was growing ugly. He practiced smiling. See, that's the terrible thing about telling someone you hate them. Now Lyle thinks there's something wrong with him. At other times, he was outdoors being his friendliest to everyone, hoping somewhere, somehow, his enemy would see what a nice crocodile he really was. He smiled big, big smiles, and he waved big, big waves, greeting one and all as warmly and joyously as he knew how. He performed all of his surefire tricks to amuse people, and practiced new ones at home at night. He was kind, helpful, and courteous. He held doors open for people loaded down with heavy packages. He offered his seat on the crowded bus. He shared his umbrella. My, doesn't he have nice manners, one lady remarked. I've never seen anything like it, answered another. Lyle is being so nice to everyone. Poor Lyle worked so hard at being nice he was positively exhausted by the end of the day. Indeed, all the Prims were unhappy about the notes. Each time they heard someone approaching outside, Joshua or Mr. Prim, sometimes the entire family, would rush for the door in hopes of catching the note writer in the act. They even took turns watching from the window. They really want to know who is writing these terrible notes. One afternoon, Mrs. Prim, Joshua, and Lyle came across the words, "Down with crocodiles," brazenly scrawled upon a fence near home. Mrs. Prim tried hopelessly to erase the nasty words with a tissue. "Well, Lyle," she said as they made their way home, "it seems no matter how much we may think we want to, it isn't always possible to please everyone or be liked by everyone." As they approached their house, they noticed the small figure of Clover Sue Hipple, the new girl in Joshua's class. By the time they reached the door, Clover was gone, but resting upon the door was still another note. "I just don't know if I can bring myself to read it," sighed Mrs. Prim, but she forced herself just the same. "Dear Lyle," she read, "I wish you would go away and never come back, ever, 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 ever again." Once more it was signed, "Your enemy." Sadly, Mrs. Prim crumpled the note in her hand. Oddly, during the next several days, Mrs. Prim and Lyle found themselves running into Clover Sue Hipple almost everywhere they went. At the supermarket, they discovered her peeking out behind a huge display of cornflakes. Another time, they caught a glimpse of her hiding behind a tree. And again, one afternoon, they discovered her crouched behind the mailbox. Each time, Mrs. Prim smiled and tried to say hello, and each time, Clover skittered off before she had a chance. What's going on with Clover? One day, as she was about to leave the house, Mrs. Prim glanced down in time to see another note wiggling its way into the house. Quickly, she opened the door before her, wide-eyed with surprise, and still clutching the note, stood Clover Sue Hipple. "Clover, dear, please don't run away," cried Mrs. Prim. "I would like to speak with you about Lyle. Has Lyle done something to make you angry with him?" "He takes my friends away from me," Clover burst out. "He what?" "He takes my friends away from me," the little girl said again. "When Lyle comes out, my friends run away. They run to play with him, and they play with him all of the time. I never have fun when Lyle is around." "But why can't you play with Lyle too?" asked Mrs. Prim. "Because," answered Clover. "Because of what?" "Because I'm not allowed. My mother said I'm not allowed to play with crocodiles." Oh, poor Clover. "Why don't you invite Clover's mother here to meet Lyle?" suggested Mr. Prim that night. "I'm sure when she sees for herself how gentle Lyle really is, she won't mind if Clover plays with him." Mrs. Prim telephoned Clover's mother the very next day. "Lyle and I want so much to meet you," she said. "Could you join us for tea tomorrow afternoon?" "I would be delighted," answered Mrs. Hipple. Mrs. Hipple made a note of the address, and all was cheerfully arranged. "Now, who is this nice Mrs. Prim?" Clover's mother wondered. Setting up the new house had left her a little time for meeting neighbors. "And who is Lyle?" The only Lyle she knew of was that wretched Lyle the crocodile creature who lived with a most peculiar family somewhere nearby. Uh-oh, she doesn't know that that's the Prim family. "Imagine," she clucked disapprovingly, "a crocodile living among decent, respectful people. But this Lyle, he must be that nice Mrs. Prim's husband," she decided. "Of course. She doesn't know that she's going to go meet a crocodile." "Remember now, Lyle," said Mrs. Prim the following afternoon, "when Mrs. Hipple arrives, greet her with your very best manners. Offer to take her coat, and when you have hung it neatly in the closet, join us in the living room. Understand?" Lyle nodded. "Good," said Mrs. Prim, humming as she returned to the kitchen. When Mrs. Hipple arrived, Lyle started down the stairs to meet her, but then he stopped. "Suppose she won't like me?" The thought popped into his head. Suddenly a wave of shyness came over Lyle. Suddenly the last thing in the world he wanted to do was meet Mrs. Hipple. "Lyle! Lyle!" called Mrs. Prim. "Lyle! Lyle! Where are you? We have company!" Mrs. Prim called again as she led her guest into the living room. He wanted to go to her, but insisted instead, and although he kept telling himself it was absolutely the silliest, most ridiculous thing he could possibly do, Lyle squeezed himself into the hall closet and hid. Mrs. Prim looked for him upstairs, and she looked for him downstairs. "I just can't imagine what has become of Lyle," he heard her exclaim. Amid the tinkling of teacups, Lyle could hear the voices of the two women. They talked about this, that, and everything under the sun. It was so stuffy and uncomfortable in the closet, he began to wish they would talk about Mrs. Hipple leaving. At long last, Lyle heard Mrs. Hipple say, "I must be going now," and Mrs. Prim say, "I'm so glad you came, and so sorry you missed Lyle, but I do hope you will be meeting him real soon." Then Lyle heard the handle of the closet door turn, and Mrs. Prim said, "Here, let me get your coat." The instant the door opened, Lyle fell upon both women. Mrs. Prim let out a sharp gasp, and Mrs. Hipple definitely screamed. "Are you all right? Are you all right?" Mrs. Prim cried out as they struggled to their feet. "Take him away! Take that monster away from me!" Mrs. Hipple began to shriek. "Oh, please, he won't hurt you. I promise he won't hurt you." Mrs. Prim tried to reassure her. "Look at him! He's more frightened than you!" "Let me out of here!" Mrs. Hipple shrieked on. "Let me out of this terrible house!" Oh no, now she really doesn't like Lyle. Mrs. Prim opened the door, and Mrs. Hipple, her hair and clothes all in a rumble, stumbled from the house. "If that crocodile ever so much as crosses my path, I'll have him arrested," she called back over her shoulder. "This is supposed to be a nice neighborhood, you know." Poor Lyle sighed. Mrs. Prim that night, "Now he's afraid to go to be arrested. We're just going to have to think of something to take his mind off his troubles. Lyle thinks that he's going to go to jail." On the first warm day, the Prims knew just what to do for Lyle. "We'll take him to the beach," they decided. "Swimming has always been Lyle's favorite sport," smiled Mrs. Prim. "And he's by far the best swimmer in the family," her husband added. While Mr. and Mrs. Prim made themselves comfortable and Joshua started on a sand castle, Lyle took a running dive into the water. Lyle's water stunts delighted everyone close by. Everyone except Mrs. Hipple, who had just arrived with Clover and was dunking her feet. Mrs. Hipple set out at once to find the lifeguard. "Lifeguard, lifeguard!" she cried. "Do you permit crocodiles to bathe here?" "Certainly not," answered the lifeguard. "Well, it might interest you to know there is a crocodile bathing out there this very minute." Mrs. Hipple pointed to the spot where she had seen the crocodile. Suddenly, everyone on the beach was looking and pointing, but not at the crocodile. They were pointing to a little girl thrashing around helplessly in the water. "Clover, Clover!" cried Mrs. Hipple. "She's drowning!" The lifeguards immediately pushed off to rescue, but Lyle raced to the scene before them. "There's a crocodile out there!" someone gasped. "No, it's Lyle!" called Mrs. Prim, standing nearby. "It's Lyle the crocodile!" Lyle brought a very wet but happy Clover safely back to the shore. "Hooray for Lyle!" the crowd shouted. "Oh, Lyle, dear friend," sobbed Mrs. Hipple. "How can I ever thank you enough?" Everyone was so proud of Lyle. He was immediately appointed honorary lifeguard. He was then given a hat, a sweatshirt, and a silver whistle. "Lyle, you're a hero," said the head lifeguard. "Feel free to come here and save people from drowning any time you choose." The next day, a note addressed to Lyle was found under the door of the house on East 88th Street. "Oh, no, not again," Mrs. Prim moaned. "Dear Lyle," read Mrs. Prim, "I love you. I love you more than anything. I love you so much I can't stand it." And the note was signed, "Your friend for life, Clover Sue Hipple." "P.S.," Mr. Prim continued, "may I play with you today? P.P.S. My mother said it's all right." Lyle smiled one of his big, big smiles. Yay! Now everybody really does love Lyle. That was a good book. I was really concerned that the little girl and her mom didn't love Lyle the way everybody else did. And they just thought that he was trouble. But he's not trouble. And when they really needed him, he really helped. And he saved that little girl in the water. That was really special. And they got to see that Lyle the crocodile really is Lovable Lyle. I really like this book. You know, it made me realize that sometimes we might not know people and we might think that they're not nice people, but if we give them the chance, we find out that they really are. And you should remember that, like if somebody new comes to your school, you should just be friendly to them and find out that they're really, really nice. That's an important thing to do. Always give people the benefit of the doubt. Always think people are going to be nice, and you be nice to them, because the nicer you are, the nicer other people will be. This was a good book, and I'm glad we found another book about Lyle. Miss Dorothy's going to have to run down to the library and see if I can find some more Lyle the Crocodile books. But not tonight, because tonight it's time for bed. I need you to get under your covers, get cuddled up, curled up, ready for a really good night's sleep. And tomorrow, if you meet a new friend or somebody new comes along, give them a chance. Find out what they're like and be nice. And also, when mom and dad tell you to do something, obey and obey right away. And then come back and see Miss Dorothy. I'm going to be sitting right here, ready to read another book to you. Bye! Thanks for reading with Miss Dorothy. I hope you enjoyed this book, and I hope you'll come back soon to read another. What's your favorite book? Drop Miss Dorothy a note and let me know. I'll go find it, and I'll read it to you. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you soon.